Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is video number 5 in our review, response, and refutation of Brock Hollett's book, Debunking Preterism. Mr. Hollett spends a good deal of time. He acknowledges that it's necessary in trying to debunk, in trying to offset, trying to mitigate and negate the time statements of the Bible. Mr. Hollett knows, without any doubt whatsoever, that if the New Testament time statements that the day of the Lord was at hand, the end of all things had drawn near, behold, I come quickly. He knows that if those statements are to be taken at face value, that the coming of the Lord is past. I've been sharing with you a response to his, may I say, far too typical attempts by Bible students to negate those time statements, and to show you how utterly desperate, how misguided, how illogical and unscriptural those attempts are. Now, this is manifested in what I want to share with you today. On page 21 and following, Mr. Hollett tells us, and he shares with us, that in the Old Testament, the prophets warned of impending judgment upon the wicked at the day of the Lord, unquote. Then he lists 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, looks like, passages, all of which use language like this: wail, for the day of the Lord is at hand. Its time is close. Alas, for the day of the Lord is near. And he argues, listen very carefully, many of the prophecies concerning the day of the Lord, catch the power of this, refer to a localized judgment that was fulfilled in part during the centuries following its announcement. But then he says, the ultimate fulfillment is at the so-called end of time. Do you realize what Mr. Hollett has done? Mr. Hollett says, look, here are all of these Old Testament prophecies. He quotes Isaiah 13. He quotes Joel 2, Joel 3, Haggai, Zephaniah. And he says, see, every one of those passages had an imminent fulfillment. They really did have a fulfillment at hand. Now, he tries to put it off centuries, which is simply unbiblical. It is wrong. To admit that any and all of these passages that he cites did in fact have a contemporary imminent fulfillment is to negate his entire argument. And secondly, you have to see, what he's doing is, number one, once again, he is admitting to the contemporary fulfillment, but number two, he is then imposing his presuppositional a priori concept of the day of the Lord into the future. Oh, but wait. You see, every one of these texts didn't say, oh, well, there's a judgment that is at hand. Oh, but wait, then the day of the Lord is far off. No, 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 no. It was the day of the Lord that was near. Mr. Hollett is attempting to dichotomize between the imminent judgment that came on the contemporaries of the prophecies and the day of the Lord. But that's not supported in any of these texts. And then, of course, and look, I'm not going to take enough videos to analyze each and every one of the prophecies that he gives. But let me just give a really, really quick response to every single one. Again, not in depth. I cover each of these in my book, Who is This Babylon?, as well as my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat. I do examine them in depth, but let me just give you a real brief overview here. He appeals to Isaiah chapter 13, 1 and following, Isaiah 13:22. Well, this was a prediction of the destruction of Babylon. Now, Mr. Hollett actually appeals to Keith Matheson, a postmillennialist, who claims that the fulfillment was hundreds of years off. No, it wasn't. In the Bible Knowledge Commentary, written by dispensationalists, they acknowledge that Babylon was destroyed initially by the Assyrians within 15 years. There is no hundreds of years off for the at-hand time statement. Now watch. For the day of the Lord is near, Ezekiel chapter 30. This is a prediction of the judgment of Egypt at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Guess what? It came in the lifetime of Nebuchadnezzar very soon. He cites Joel 1:15, Joel 2:1, Joel 3:14. Now, this is very subtle. It's easy to overlook, or perhaps it's purposeful. In Joel 1 and Joel 2, the day of the Lord is near. The day of the Lord is very near. Well, guess what? There was an imminent application of that. Remember, Mr. Hollett agrees with that. But in Joel 2:28, it shall come to pass afterward. After what? After the imminent day of the Lord. There are 2 days of the Lord in the book of Joel. There is the day of the Lord that was very near, Joel 1:15, Joel 2:1, Joel 2:10. There is a day of the Lord that would come afterwards, or in the last days. And in those days and at that time, Joel 3:14 says, the day of the Lord is at hand. He doesn't say this other day of the Lord was at hand when he wrote. He is projecting himself into the last days and saying, in the last days, the day of the Lord is at hand. Projected imminence. I discuss this in detail in my book, Who is This Babylon? Oh, and then he goes to Obadiah 1 in verse 15. The day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. I find it remarkable and disturbing that people would use Obadiah 1:15 in this way. Obadiah is a prediction of the destruction of Edom. Obadiah verses 1 through 3. There's only one chapter. Now watch this. The day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. Well, in Jeremiah 25 and Ezekiel 25, we find this identical prophecy reiterated. Not only that, we find a list of 25 nations that would fall at the same time. And oh, by the way, they would fall at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And guess what? Obadiah was fulfilled in 583 BC when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Edom. There truly was an at-hand fulfillment. And by the way, folks, the kingdom of Edom, I'm not talking physical dirt. The kingdom of Edom that existed at that time, that was the enemy of Israel, does not exist today. Now, you may say, well, they're Arabs and they're enemies of Israel. That's not the point. This is talking about, Obadiah is talking about the kingdom of Edom, that when Babylon invaded Judah and the Judeans fled, these Edomites attacked them and did not give them help. It is that kingdom, it is that nation, it is that people that is the brunt of the prediction of the book of Obadiah. Now watch this. Obadiah, the day of the Lord is very near upon all the nations. What nations? The 25 nations mentioned in Jeremiah 25, in Ezekiel 25, at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And it was fulfilled in 583 BC. Watch this. In Malachi chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, the Lord said to Israel, I have loved you. And Israel responded, how have you loved us? And the Lord said, I have hated Esau and loved Jacob. I have made Edom a desolation, a habitation for the jackals. Citing, by the way, Isaiah chapter 34. When Obadiah predicted it, it was at hand. Malachi looked back on it as fulfilled. Number one, Mr. Hollett's admission that there was an imminent fulfillment destroys his argument. Number two, he completely and totally ignores the actual historical realities that were at play in each one of these texts. Not one of these texts extrapolates the day of the Lord far off into the future. As I mentioned, I cover all of this and more. In this book, I have a very special study of God and time. It is more expansive even than this. In this book, I demonstrate that every single one of these passages that Mr. Hollett adduces was in fact fulfilled imminently, just as the language demanded. And thus, Mr. Hollett's repeated attempts to do away with the imminent time language of the Bible fails utterly. He has, in fact, debunked his own debunking book by admitting there was, in fact, an imminent fulfillment of those predictions. He has falsified his own claim that there was another far off. How can something be truly imminent and not imminent? Makes no sense, does it? Well, all right. Thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. I appreciate it so very, very much. Have a safe weekend. Lord willing, I'll see you on Monday.